This is discussion post number 5 by Sam Procise. So we had to watch a series of videos followed by reading a series of articles and had to answer 4 questions. The first question is, do you think the court ruled properly on gatherings in New York City? Why or why not? Be sure to consider the implication and precedents as defined in the text. So, personally, I believe this is a question that one would answer based on the values that they have. And I'll explain that later in my answer. But start off with some of the legal facts. The Supreme Court ultimately, and at the end of the day, had the final decision, and they do have the right to overturn state laws in the New York City case. So that's the first part where it was ruled properly. The Supreme Court's job, in general, is to interpret the law and make decisions based on the Constitution and legal principles, which they did do in the New York City case, which is the second layer where they ruled properly. The third layer is religious freedom is something that is technically and legally protected by the First Amendment. And so, technically speaking, the ban on the gatherings did violate the First Amendment. And therefore, without any context and just looking at the facts of the court case, no precedents applied, the court did rule properly on the gatherings on 3 different layers. And to quote one of the justices that ruled on it, the restrictions at issue here, by effectively barring many from attending religious services, strike at the very heart of the First Amendment's guarantee of religious liberty. They were right, legally speaking. However, there's a few other aspects to consider. It's important to consider the role of precedents in this case. In previous cases, precedence was generally not allowed to place or frowned upon, I should say, to place a ban on any sort of religious freedom or religious gatherings unless there is a significant enough reason. In the Smith case, the court ruled that the Native American group was not exempt from the drug laws in the state, and banned a lot of their religious practices, religious gatherings, and they were not allowed to use the drug they used for their religious freedom. And this was fascinating for so many reasons because what this does is it points out that the court's rulings in the New York City case is done ignoring precedents. And I'll get to that especially in the next question and explain it a little more. And technically, in the New York City case, there was a significant enough reason based on precedent that these gatherings were restricted, and the court ignored precedents in this case and would rather side with the fact of holistic religious freedom or whole religious freedom. My personal interpretation, I'm not saying that this is correct at all, is that the court rulings on religious freedom cases like Smith and New York City are largely left to the values of the judges, so it's tough to say whether they ruled properly or not, because it's tough to decide whether they're being impartial or not. But overall, in my opinion, if Smith was a present case like today, judges would claim that they are not exempt from the drug laws. It seems to be a bit of a double standard because in New York City they were fine with letting these people come in, but we know how the court has ruled, especially when it comes to different minority groups. But going back on track, the ultimate decision on the court ruling on NYC based on the legal facts, which is the job of the Supreme Court, was right. Based on legal standards and the Constitution, they made the right decision. They did, however, ignore precedents, which is a big deal. However, it's also really important to note that one cannot enforce the Supreme Court to follow precedents. And I do believe that this was the wrong ruling on moral grounds, simply because I believe public health and safety took precedence over large religious gatherings, but that is my own opinion and it is subjective. Overall, I believe this question is largely subjective, but if we just look at the legal facts, they did rule properly, even if they did ignore precedent. The second question is, how does the ruling by the conservative majority justices highlight the importance of precedents and why? The ruling on the New York City case by the conservative judges highlights the importance of precedents because they ignored it. And like I talked about on the last slide, precedent should have played a role in the New York City case, but was ignored by the conservative majority, resulting in, I would say, not necessarily the wrong ruling, but a ruling that should have been looked at further. So, to quote something that Bill Clinton signed into law, governments shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a general rule of applicability, unless application of the rule is in the least restrictive means of furthering a compelling governmental interest. This was signed by Bill Clinton, and this was the precedence, and this shows what the precedence was, and this specific precedence was applied on two cases before it was written, Sherbert and Smith. In the New York City case, precedent should have been followed and enforced. However, legally, like I said, one cannot force the Supreme Court to follow and adhere to precedents. The current Supreme Court has now made it a pretty common habit to go against and ignore precedents, which is dangerous on many levels because precedents protect so many important things like civil rights. And in the recent Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court again went against precedent. Another example of this court just ignoring it. Precedent is supposed to set a legal standard, and it has been ignored on recent cases. It exists to preserve the court's legitimacy, and since it's not been acknowledged, the current conservative majority court is quickly losing its legitimacy amongst the American public. The more precedents and legal standards that are destroyed, the less the public trusts the Supreme Court to rule impartially. The less the public trusts the Supreme Court to rule impartially, the less trust there is in U.S. politics. The less trust in U.S. politics, the less trust there is in democracy, which, as we all understand, being in this class, is extremely dangerous. Precedence is something that is really important and must be acknowledged and enforced into law. The next question was, do you think do you see any contradictions in the ruling's use of the First Amendment on the freedom of religion and employment in Divison v. Smith? Why? And give detailed examples. So, personally, I do see a contradiction in the Divison v. Smith on the grounds of freedom of religion. I'm going to compare this case to the Sherbert case just to highlight how huge the contradiction was. In the Sherbert case, the court ruled in favor of an individual who was denied unemployment benefits for refusing to work on her Sabbath day. The court required the government to show a significant reason to justify the infringement on her religious practices, or religious freedom. The Smith decision, on the other hand, allowed for denial of benefits in a situation involving religious practices and drug use without requiring a compelling interest or reason to be demonstrated. This contradiction stems from the fact that Employment Divison v. Smith lowered the level of scrutiny applied to laws burdening religious practices, which does seem to contradict the First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of religion by making it easier for the government to restrict religious practices without demonstrating a compelling state interest or reason. The court's rulings in Employment Divison v. Smith show that the neutral, generally applicable laws could be enforced against religious practices, even if those practices were burdened. The court no longer required the government to show a compelling state interest or significant reason when it came to laws of religious practices. The New York City case is another level of contradiction. The New York City people were allowed to gather, despite being in the middle of a national and public health emergency. They were allowed to gather on the grounds of religious freedom. The native group in Smith, however, was denied access to drugs and the drug use because it went against California drug law. Honestly, the results of these cases do show how the Supreme Court can contradict itself, and it's not always impartial, or consistent, I should say. The First Amendment is one that is largely left up to the interpretation of the one viewing it or ruling based off it, especially in terms of values. So the values are looking to protect are the values that these judges have. There have been multiple examples of this, even in modern times with the New York City case especially. The final question was to find a story about the Supreme Court in any reputable newspaper, WSJ, NY Times, LA Times, or local news. Personally, I chose the New York Times. And then give a summary of the story's content. Be sure to explain the facts. Who, what, when, where, and when. and then touch how it fits into the content from the textbook and the videos above in the Supreme Court. This is something I'm really excited to talk about. So, there was a recent court ruling in June where the court sided with a 6-3 majority with a web designer. The basis of this case is that the web designer was supposedly approached by a gay couple looking to create a wedding website, and she denied them on the grounds of religious freedom. The New York Times article explains that this case was created to smash discrimination laws and increase people's ability to be discriminatory against LGBTQ people. It explained how companies and people now had the right, it was used to make it so companies and people had the right to deny any service or product to people of the part of the LGBTQ community, which is a form of discrimination. And what's interesting is that Smith, the web designer, argued that her websites should be classed as art and therefore protected by her constitutional right to free speech under the First Amendment. That was her justification. But the thing that makes this case so interesting is that there was no gay couple. Stewart, the man that was said to approach her with his husband, said in the article that, quote, I was incredibly surprised given the fact that I've been happily married to a woman for the last 15 years. So, the web designer made up the entire story to try and harm LGBTQ people rights. And this connects to our textbook and the videos above about the Supreme Court in many ways. So, I'm going to start with the crash course video. The crash course video, the first one, said that in order for the Supreme Court to hear a case, there must be a controversy, not just looking at a hypothetical scenario. The Smith v. Stewart case, for example, the court actively ruled on a hypothetical scenario. And to quote the crash course guy, there has to be an actual injury first. There was no injury in this case. And therefore, that's just one reason why it should never have been heard. And yeah. And secondly, in order for the Supreme Court to hear a case, there must be a quote standing. Standing refers to, in order to bring a case, the parties must have a substantial stake in the outcome. The web designer Smith had no substantial outcome, therefore, it's another reason why this case should never have been heard. The Supreme Court should be held accountable for their actions, and this was a massive mistake. The article from the New York Times pointed out that this was a, quote, jump the gun scenario, where the court wanted to push their almost extreme yet extremist opinions and agenda. Overall, to summarize, the recent case was simply not ripe, to quote the crash course video again, to be heard by a court, but it was anyway, making it extremely controversial on so many levels. This is a case story that has connected to so much of what we've studied so far in class based on discrimination and such, as well as the Supreme Court rulings in the textbook and both in the crash course. Overall, I believe that this scenario should never have happened in the first place, but I can't change it. So my personal opinion would say to overturn this ruling. However, being realistic, that will probably not happen. But yeah, that's my presentation. Thanks for listening.